I want to read to you a little bit from the Zohar. And it's only a small section because we're going to talk basically about the Ketoret, the incense. But in doing so, there's a lot of other things that you have to understand. I have a lot of desire to understand this because I've seen it. From the Zohar, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. If people knew how great it is when they say the section Patim HaKetaret before God, they would take each and every word of the section and place it in their heads like a golden crown. Whoever says Patim HaKetaret each day in the morning and in the evening slowly, without skipping even a single word, and understands what he is saying, he is protected against all evil occurrences and evil thoughts from the evil of death. He can rest assured that all day he will not be harmed in any way. He will also be protected from the punishments of purgatory, and he will have a portion in the world to come. Kind of a powerful statement that seems like it's out of nowhere, and how do you back up what you're saying? And the answer is, it's there, but it's going to require digging. 3 of my friends gave me the opportunity of a lifetime to go with them to Israel for a month. We went at Sukkot. We stayed in Yeshuv. We slept on mattresses. And it didn't bother me. In fact, I became more excited each time I walked down the street to the synagogue and we went in. It was a Karlibach synagogue, and I don't know if you know Karlibach. Karlibach is probably the closest thing to hippie that you can find in the synagogue movement. He is probably the most loving man. Every day that he had free, he would go to the prisons. He would walk into a prison. Every inmate that he saw, he would kiss them on their cheeks and give them a hug and tell them God loved them. It became so famous for that people began to do it on their own. And he began to change the inner workings of a prison. He was also a musician. He wrote constantly. And so he would take his guitar, strap it on his back, he would go into the prisons, and he would do his ministry. Well, we went to a Karlibach synagogue, and we were there, and it was interesting because you're not used to seeing people walking up and touching the Torah scroll with a 45 strapped to their hip, because most of the men there carried, because we were only 5 miles away from Jericho. And about a month earlier, 2 Gentiles had cut down what you would recognize as the Jericho Road, the original Jericho Road, not the one that's now called the Jericho Road, but it really was the Jericho Road. And they were both beheaded. And so everybody made sure that everybody knew what was going on. So anyway, we would go there, and there would be I would sit next to Asher because I felt comfortable next to him, and I didn't know why until eventually we sat down, we started talking. I said, Asher, you're going to have to explain this to me. He says, when I go to church, I went to church, it was always so quiet in there. You people are always talking. You're talking when somebody else is talking. And Asher told me, he says, you will know when the Messiah is about to come. He says, so you see that guy over there? He's a Levi. Actually, he's a Cohen. He's supposed to lead us and teach us. When he finally says, it's time for us to learn, know that the Messiah is coming soon. And so they basically had a good time. By the way, he was a former Baptist minister from Cut and Shoot, Texas. He had gone through the process of Aliyah, he had converted, and he married a non-practicing Jewish wife who eventually also became Orthodox. In fact, the whole community was Orthodox. But anyway, so much for the story. Larry and Tony and Glenda, my friends, one time came to our church And Larry brought with him a vial. It was only about this big, and it had red dirt in it. That's what I thought it was red dirt. It was incense, ketoret, what you're going to be talking about and learning about tonight, I hope. It was amazing. He told us how he found it, because you see, they were a part of the archaeological dig that uncovered 1,600 pounds of this red dirt. 2 years earlier, they had uncovered a small bottle, 5 inches tall, of the anointing oil. It was wrapped in a palm leaf, laying in a 5-foot depression. Basically, they got started because there was a man named Vendell Jones, who was a Baptist minister from Palestine, Texas, who had been teaching and finally came to the conclusion that what he had been teaching all along was not right. He knew Greek, he knew Hebrew, and he finally met a Lebanese Jew named Zahara, who had as strong a will as he did, because he was pretty tough. But anyway, she had convinced him about Torah, and so he converted, in essence, to becoming a B'nai Noach. He left Baptist church and became a B'nai Noach. Well, in the process, he had always loved archaeology. And so they moved back to Israel, and they lived in Jerusalem area, where he worked on digs, several digs, including the one that's now ongoing, or it's been ongoing, where they're looking at David's palace off to the far side of the Temple Mount. And during that time, stories had come to him, because you guys all remember the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? 1952, there was one of the scrolls that was brought out of the ground that was not paper, not parchment. It was copper. It was a little bit mutilated, because copper, is very thin. And after a period of time of almost, 2,000 years, it was sitting in the ground. Even though it was semi-protected, it had kind of sealed, and so some of the letters were no longer visible on there. And it was written in Greek and ancient Hebrew. He couldn't read any of it. Oh, he could read the Greek. He couldn't read the Hebrew. But his wife could. And so they photocopied it, and his wife used it to help him look for 64 items that were used in the temple and the tabernacle. The scroll was really not a scroll on Isaiah or anything else. It was a treasure map. And the map had been created, most likely, by Jeremiah. And actually, Jeremiah didn't write. He had Baruch, who wrote for him, and probably somebody else. Because during those days in which the Babylonians were moving around and moving in on them, Jeremiah knew what was coming. And so Jeremiah, with the help of the priests at that point in time, and the acceptance of the king, moved the artifacts out of the temple. So the Ark of the Covenant was never taken. Neither was several of the other things. Because you remember, Solomon's temple actually had 10 menorahs in it. It had 10 tables of showbread. It was not a single. So one of those was moved down, and that was the one that belonged to the original tabernacle, Moshe's tabernacle. And so what they did was they went down from Jerusalem down to Qumran, which, if you've been there, you know is about 6 or 7 miles due east, a little bit south. And so as they were moving down to that particular area, they had followed a specific line, and that's what Vendell spent almost a year looking for. He was looking for a cave that had columns in front. That's how they described it. Setting up off the ground, off the bluff, and is actually up probably a good 60, 65 feet up. And beside it was the Hakipah Wadi. And he would continually walk down the Qumran Valley looking for those two things. What he didn't realize was, just to the north of the Wadi was the place where they would bring the Azazel Yisrael, or not the one for the goat for Azazel, back in Leviticus, the 16th chapter. And they knew that he didn't know then, but he does now, and he's no longer with us, but I got to go there, and we stood on that bluff where they threw the goats off. And across the valley, you could see Gilgal. And I don't know if you understand, but Gilgal's where they originally settled as before they began to occupy the land. Down in that valley, you don't have a Bible. If you did, you could turn to Amos, if I'm going to. Well, that's okay. Most of you didn't expect me to teach anyway, so it's not an amazing thing.
Here's a map over here.
Oh. I'm leaving, Michael. You're going to have to follow me. Okay, so here's Jerusalem. Down in here, well, over here, was where Jericho is. And down here, south of Jericho, is a bluff. And it's straight out from this wadi. Now, the wadi does not run all the way through now. That's where Vendel was having his problems. He could not go far enough to see it. And so what happens was, he finally went above and looked down, because there were 7 wadis that are located here on the copper scroll. He was looking for a particular wadi, because that wadi would tell him right next to it, to the south, you will find the Cave of the Columns. And so that's what he was looking for. So anyway, as he goes down to this particular area, he sees wadis from above. He goes down into the valley, looks up, and he says, that's where it's at. And so he began to look at the wadis themselves. As he's beginning to find the right wadi, then he sees the Cave of the Columns. Goes back up into there. There are 64 items that he's supposed to find. Some of them are major items. In fact, the item that they were actually looking for were the ashes of the red heifer. I don't know how much you know about the ashes of the red heifer, but when it comes, know the scripture, Ezekiel. This one you're familiar with, so you don't have to really read it, but it's in the 36th chapter of the book of Ezekiel. It says, I will take you from among the nations and gather you from the lands, and I will bring you to your own soil. Then I will sprinkle pure water upon you, that you may be cleansed, and I will cleanse you from all your contamination and from all your idols. Well, there's only one substance that can actually be put into the water which will cause the cleansing, and that's the ashes of the red heifer, the para adumah. In the Quran, it's a yellow cow. That's what they're looking for. Whoever finds their cow first wins. That's the way the game is being played. Now, it seems rather strange, but as you're going through this story, one of the things that you find out is that that was a prominent item that he wanted to find, because if he could find that, he could change the culture of Israel. Israel is not all religious. Of course, you probably figured that out by now. In fact, there are several small collectives that are very orthodox, very religious, but there's a great number of them. They're basically, in fact, at the base of the hill where the Cave of the Column is, was one of the first kibbutzes in the entire nation. It's communist. Can you imagine? You're moving there so you can be a communist. But anyway, they've kept them now from digging for the last 6 to 8 years. But in the course of the story, one of the things that they were looking for, if they could find this water, Vendel believed it would change the course of Israel. Well, he had arrived there back in 67, and in 67, he was a nobody, until he was out there looking around trying to find the wadi. Now, he won't find it for several more years, because he's part-time doing this, because he's still working on digs. And so, as he's out there, the 6-day war goes off. He's colorblind, which doesn't mean much, except if you're colorblind, you know that you can't recognize all the colors. And if you're camouflaging your cannons, and your artillery, which the Jordanians were doing, he looked at it and he says, that's stupid, I can see them. But he was the only one because he was colorblind in green. He couldn't see green. So therefore, the cannons stood out like they were just there, nothing around them. Well, he won a military rank because he stood out there and he called in the artillery. And basically, they eliminated the Jordanians on the east side of the Jordan River. He continued to work with them, and he created, for those who have gone over to Israel on a Christian tour, he created the Christian Guidebook for those who wanted to go to Israel to study the Christian sites. Because obviously his Christian background gave him ample understanding of what's going on and where it's at. So he made that book. He's did lots of things over there. He worked with Chaim Richman. And one of the things that was happening between he and Richman, Chaim Richman, who's one of the members of the Sanhedrin, the new Sanhedrin that's been established, he believes that they can establish tabernacle temple worship, but they don't need the Temple Mount. They can do it at Mount Carmel. And Vendel and he argue over and over again, no, you can't. You need to do it in Gilgal. And he says, we can't get to Gilgal. Gilgal is out in the valley. Here, one of the things that you can find as you're down into that valley is that's where there were leftovers, the remains of the getters, the walled sections. Remember, every tribe had to go by a section. They could not go integrate. Each tribe had their own particular place that they were supposed to be. Well, in order to make that work, they created boundaries for the tabernacle for each of the tribes out so that nobody violated the tabernacle area. Well, if you were standing on the bluff where they threw the goat off, you can look down and you can see the partial remnants of a buried wall. They got permission because of Vendel being in the military. They got permission to go through the gate to get out there because you see it's a minefield now. Completely, nobody can get to it. And so one of the things they did was they went out there, sometimes crawling a little bit, out into this area. And as you get to the middle of the area, you find the wall where it was and where it's been breached or knocked down. In the book of Amos, in the 9th chapter of the book of Amos, you'll find a section where it talks about the breaches in the wall of the booth of David. Well, the tabernacle was called the booth of David, as David brought the tabernacle up to the temple area. So it's called that. And so they began to go out there to look. They couldn't dig, but they just began to look. And they moved a little dirt and debris. And by the way, there are no flies. There are no insects of any kind. The ground is completely sterile. Where Gilgal, where the tabernacle stood, that whole area is completely sterile. Nothing. But that shouldn't surprise us because when the temple was in function, there were no flies, there were no snakes, there were no insects on the Temple Mount. Because you'd see flies would be naturally there because look how much blood, look how much slaughtering would go on. Flies would swat, but there wasn't any. And so as they walked out there, they began to notice, and they found other artifacts. The molds used to make the temple furniture by Solomon. He buried the molds out in Gilgal. All of that is all sitting there. Just across the Jordan River, a half a mile down on the Dead Sea, is the Valley of the Passengers, where if you read Ezekiel 38 and 39, you know that there'll be a great war. It'll take 7 months to bury the dead and up to 7 years to take care of the implements of war. All of that in a very small area. Well, anyway, I got to go with Larry and those over there. One of the things we looked hardest for was a way into the caves itself without disturbing the people on the side. But there's nothing we could do. But Larry had gone over and he had come back with that little vial. Tony and Glenda, besides the cave column opening, the map says that you're going to go round to another side and you'll go into the cave from another way and you'll find there precious things. 1,600 pounds of red dirt in a brown scape. It was just laying there. But that's not enough for a year's supply. It took almost 1,800 pounds of incense every year to take care of what needed to be done at the temple. 5 pounds of incense every day were burned. And on Yom Kippur, double that, then double it again. Every year, that's how much they had to use. 1,800 pounds of red dirt. They found 1,600. They gave some to the rabbis that were in the area that were helping. Shlomo Gordon, I don't know if you know him, but in the 6-Day War, he's the guy who walked out into the desert, blew the shofar, and the Egyptians ran out of their boots and headed back to Egypt because the army was too strong. Did you not hear that story? Amazing stories, miracles that are happening all the time. Well, anyway, in the course of time, Larry began to explain to us a little bit about the incense. Now, in this particular section that you're looking at, and Shmos, there are two parts to it. One is in Kisi, when Moses is on top of the mountain. Vayakel is the first section that he speaks the day after he leaves the mountain. Up on the mountain, he's given the information regarding the actual incense itself. In the section that we're about to read, that's the section where he is actually down at the bottom of the mountain and he's asked everybody to gather. Vayakel, the word to gather here is to be a collective of one. Moshe is trying to restart Sinai. Everybody becomes one. That is his goal. But it should be our goal all the time. We should always be one. And so as he comes down from the mountain, he's beginning to tell them, these are the pieces of furniture that I want you to make. As you're making these pieces of furniture, there's the specific things that you need. He will tell Bezalel about not only the pieces of furniture, because he's the person who will make them. What's the only piece of furniture that Bezalel doesn't know how to make? The menorah. How do you get gold arms to stand up? Nobody could figure it out. God made it for them. But anyway, that's back to the story. So the concept was he was to watch and to use the alphabet to make the pieces of furniture, because that's what he understood. The letters, how they work together to make building blocks to build all of these things. And so here in Exodus, in the section in Vayakel in 37, notice what he says, because this is important. He says, he made an incense altar of acacia wood, a cubit its length, a cubit its width. It was square, 2 cubits was its height, and from it were its horns. He covered it with pure gold, its roof and its walls all around and all of its horns, and he made for it a gold crown all around. He made for it 2 gold rings under its crown on its 2 corners, on 2 sides, as housing for staves, with which to carry it. Now, if you had problems carrying the 4-ton Ark of the Covenant, you're going to have as much trouble carrying this piece of furniture also. Again, the priests didn't carry anything. It carried them to where they were going. So he makes a box out of wood, and then they put gold plating on it. Then the question is, we're going to make it into an altar for incense. We concept fire. What happens to gold plating when it's heated? It melts. There was no fire in the altar. It was something else. All part of God's understanding and God's teaching. So let's go back a second and figure out. We had 4 pieces of furniture that we're dealing with in this small space. In the one room, we're going to put the Ark of the Covenant. In the other room, we're going to put 3 pieces of furniture, and they're all going to have a specific place that they sit because they have a specific purpose that they're going to do. The interesting thing is the rabbis say the altar of incense shouldn't be there. It has no purpose in making the Mishkan what it is because it doesn't go with the Mishkan, it goes with God. Now remind yourself, what was it that God wanted to have happen by building this building? That he might dwell with them. What happens if you were to dwell with God's presence? Not as we have it today, but as it would have been back in those days. How powerful was God's presence? So this little box was not designed for anything but protection for the priests and those who were there. It seems rather strange. We know the menorah created the light, was used for the gematria and all of the other things. The table of showbread was there for the food, the idea of manna, all of that. But the altar had no purpose other than to protect them from. As they began to build the furniture and place it in there, remember, Moses will take 7 days. He will go out of himself, which is what I talked about last time I was here, and many of you weren't here, so let me go this far. Moses' name is not in Ketisi. The question is, why is his name not there? And the rabbis will tell you, because he wasn't Moses in that chapter. Because Moses, there were 3 things that makes our soul. The first is called Ein, nothingness. In the beginning, you and I, our souls are a part of a collective. Not Vendel, but his counterpart, Indiana, talked about the well of souls. We're a part of the souls. The second part of us is called Or, light. Because as we're moving away from God, back towards this world, we are becoming light. And eventually we will arrive here, we will be thick light. Because energy thickens, and that's what we see. That's called matter. And so as we approach the earth, we become light. And in this light, if you understand anything about the prism, you know that the prism breaks light up into colors. And every object has its own color hue, its own spectrum. Each of us has our own color of light. We're all different. It's the first stage of becoming self. The last stage is called name. It's what your parents did to you when you arrived. They named you. And when they named you, they had a specific idea in mind of what you were going to be like. Some Jewish families meet Benjamin, the doctor. The kid's 1 year old. This is my son, the lawyer. He's in preschool. They've already defined what they were going to be. Your moms and dads probably had some idea what you were going to be, although I'm not sure what all you thought. By the time I was in 3rd grade, I knew I was going to be a teacher. I had already come to that conclusion. In fact, several people had told me, he'd make a great teacher. Well, 43 years worth. And I moved on. But the concept is the fact that you have a name. When you take those 3 objects and you do the gematria for them, you will find that they add up to 613 when you go from Ein to Or to Shmos. And in this case, I want to replace Shmos with Moshe, Rabbeinu. When I do that, when I replace and give him a real name, Moshe Rabbeinu, I again have 613. His name's in here. You just can't see it because it's already there in the menorah. As we go through the stories then, as we go through the process, there's significance in what's happening. And that's the thing that I want to try to get across to you. Now remember, Shimon said that if we could pray the prayer, and what's the prayer that they pray? Is back in Ketisi, which is what Moses received when he was on top of the mountain. And it's what chapter is it in? It's got to be before the cow business. Oh, it is. Here it is. It's in chapter 30. It's verse number 34. This is the substance of the prayer. Now, you can get a Siddur, and you could do a much better job, but the idea is Hashem said to Moses, take for yourself spices, stakte, onka, and galbanum, and spices and pure frankincense. These shall be of equal weight. You shall make it into incense, a spiced compound, and the handiwork of a perfumer, thoroughly mixed, pure and holy. And you shall grind some of it finely and place some of it before the testimonial tablets in the tent of meeting. Where's the testimonial tablets? In the ark. One day a year, that altar moves. And it moves from one side of the curtain to the other. That's the day called Yom Kippur. There's a function in moving to that particular place, but that's what's going to happen. It's going to move under the curtain, and it's going to be there because it has to create a thick smoke, because that's how the high priest, the Kohen Hagadol, is going to see God, because that's what he promises him. Where I shall designate a time to meet you, and it shall remain holy of holies to you, and the incense that you shall make in its proportion you shall not make for yourselves, it shall remain holy to you for Hashem. Whoever makes it is like to smell it shall be cut off from his people. Now, the story begins then. We have some ingredients, but we don't have all of them. I'm starting the study of Ezra. If you know Ezra, that's the beginning of the Second Temple period. Ezra is one of the great assembly. Men that had been, by divine guidance, had been given more knowledge than you could possibly understand. Ezra was there, Nehemiah was there, Mordecai was there, multiple others. But anyway, 120 altogether. And these men understood that the Jewish people were getting dumber. We think that the world is getting smarter. Look how much technology is. Look at all the things that are going on. There's no way we could be getting dumber until you begin to understand what they know. Because you see, they were losing their language. If you lose God's language, how do you communicate? It was important. And so what they did was they took all of the oral understandings, because you see, how many times did Moshe go up on the mountain? 3. Spent 120 days on top of the mountain. First 40 with him, getting what we would call the 10 Commandments. Goes back up, works with God, makes a deal, we're still here. Goes to this third set of 40. At that point in time, he's now writing the tablet that he was going to bring down. How long would it take to make 10 Commandments? That wasn't all they were working on. Moses was hearing what they were what they needed to know. Because you see, there were 11 ingredients in this list of ingredients for the incense, not 5. There were 11. In fact, where you see the word spices here, you see it twice in the sentence, indicates double. You're to double the number. It's in the Hebrew. And I've already mangled enough words in Jewish for you. So, but the concept was that it's double. 11 ingredients that are there. And of the 11 ingredients, 10 of them were perfumes. Well, actually, they were hallucinogens in some cases. And so some people, the Arabs, will tell you that the Jews are really interested in finding hallucinogenic drugs to use, but it's not. But these drugs are all made out of grasses and weeds. And anybody knows anything about grasses and weeds, if you're going to grind it, what's going to happen to the leftover? It's going to go up. Now this going up is okay, except for the fact if you're trying to make it perfect, you can't lose your mind before you make the drug. And so they were forced to do as the oral story tells them, as you're grinding, you must speak. You are talking to the grains that you're crushing. Well, that didn't seem to make sense, except for the fact that the vapor coming from their mouths did what to the dust coming up? Got it wet, and it settled. And so God had a whole purpose and a whole plan. They couldn't make it anywhere but at the temple itself. They couldn't bring the ingredients in. Nobody could bring their own in. They had to bring in the money, and it was purchased. That way nobody owned any of it. So they bring the grains in, the weeds in, because some of them are weeds, and they begin to crush them, and they begin to speak the prayer. The prayer itself becomes then significant to them because they are now processing how the ingredients are supposed to be made. And remember, they're grinding and they're putting it all together because there's nobody who has a rolling pin big enough for 1,600 pounds of incense or 1,800 pounds of incense. So they're working in a large group towards the back of the temple. And they would continually grind it until it was so fine, and then they would mix the mixes together. When Larry brought his little jar over, it had the 11 ingredients in it. One of the ingredients it didn't have, that wasn't even enlisted in here, was the ingredient for the smoke. Because you see, this product couldn't just spread out. It had to go straight up. No matter what the prevailing wind was, it would cross the wind to go straight up. You ever see those pictures where it talks about the cloud by day and you see that cloud or whatever you want to call it, that coming straight up and filling out? That's exactly what this incense was doing, was going up and out. In fact, the incense was spreading out so far that if you listen to the stories about the Temple Mount, most people smelled it before they saw it, because the smell was pervasive. In the story, as we're going through, one of the things that happened was when Glenda was the one who found it, stumbled upon it, she saw it, she said, well, that's interesting. That doesn't fit here, because this is gray ground, and that's red. It shouldn't be here. Well, they began to bag a little bit of a sample because they were going to take it in. The sun got to it. What happened with the vapor that came from their mouths, that was now in the bag, that was now sitting there in the sun? It began to cook the incense, and they began to smell it. They took it to a friend of theirs that was in Jerusalem, who was a chemist, and asked him to analyze it. They also took samples to the rabbis, and the rabbis took it and they had it analyzed also. Tim said, well, this looks like the stuff that's written in the Bible. This is the incense. And they said, no, it can't be. He says, well, yeah, it's lost 15% of its potency. It's been buried for nearly 3,000 years, and it's lost 15% of its potency. Now, as they go through this process, Tim is working with it in his office. He's not allowed to use fire on it, so they used hydrochloric acid, which is similar to the substance that must have been used, because had they used real fire in the altar of incense, you would have melted the gold off the sides of the instrument. It smolders there. It doesn't burn. It smolders. Tim worked in his office. He said he took it out of the bag and it stained his fingers. Not only did it stain his fingers, he found that his clothing began to smell like the incense. And then his hair smelled like the incense. And he finally went home that night, having washed himself. His family noticed that he smelled. He smelled good, but he smelled. He stayed there all night, and they began to smell of incense. Tim went back to work. One of the things that they found out was Tim's office was contaminated with the smell for 2 months. Now, he only worked with it one day, and at the end of one day, it was gone, but the smell never left. So for 2 months, the smell was there, and then after that, they said, well, the smell's no longer here, but what's here is it smells clean. And it smelled clean for another month. And then finally, the smell was gone. Worked with it one day, a small amount, 3 months. Can you understand how the Temple Mount could have smelled so aromatic for any length of time? And imagining they're burning 5 pounds a day. Everybody who came to the mountain smelled of the incense. In fact, they began to understand, well, first off, they were coming to the outer altar, not to the inner altar, right? The outer altar was responsible for what? The sacrifices. What we say is karev, getting closer to God, to draw close, because that's why they brought their offerings, was to draw close to God, to seek His forgiveness, to seek His blessing. But before they even got to the point of offering their offerings, they began to think differently. It's understood that the incense itself is responsible for teshuvah, repentance. The people were coming with a repentant heart to the mountain. Things were changing. But again, Vayakel is about what? To gather together. How? As one. The goal of the people was to gather together. They didn't know why. God knew why. One day a year, the altar was pushed under so that God and the Kohen could communicate. Now remember, the Kohen had gone through all sets of offerings and all of the other things, but he needed the smoke in order to protect himself from God's presence. We need something to protect us from God's presence, even though we know God's presence is with us all times. But the significance is here the reality of time and space disappeared. Because you remember, well, I shouldn't say that. Do you understand that the tabernacle itself was a time machine? Time and space disappeared. The Ark of the Covenant was too big to fit in the room that it was in. But yet it did. How could it fit in a room it couldn't fit in? Because there was no space in there. It was different than science has ever understood it. Time also disappears when you're in the presence of God. Because who created time? God. When did He create it? When He created the first day. Prior to that, there was no time. There was no space because He was it. In order to create space, what did He have to do? Zimzum, He had to withdraw Himself in order to create a space for us to occupy. That's what was happening inside that little room. Above that room, the tabernacle was a 10 by 10. or the Holy of Holies was a 10 by 10. But above it was an area that was open. In fact, it was cleaned by special cleaners who had been Levites who had been given the task of cleaning up above the room. Why could they be above the room and not in the room? Because the room wasn't there. Space didn't exist inside that little room. Time didn't exist inside that little room. They were above it. One of the things that Haim Luzzatto, I don't know if you've ever read any of his books, tremendous writer. In fact, a lot of the books that he wrote, he was so young that they said you couldn't possibly have written this and this can't possibly be true, so they made him burn them. So we only have 4 or 5 works left of what Luzzatto wrote. One of them is talked about the coming temple, the third temple, and how all the temples themselves line up. How the land mass underneath it, the Evan Shittah, all of that fits together. And so one of the things was that when these men are above here, they're in between time and space. Something you and I would like to do, never grow old. Literally, they could have stayed in there and never grew old. Because there was no time, there was no space. They were between it. As the story goes, I guess it's almost 8 o'clock. Let me skip ahead. Can you see I brought a few things? Oh, you got a question? Uh-oh. Go ahead. Make sure it's an easy one, because I'm only a teacher.
Something I recognize, you were talking about the stuff going up.
Mm-hmm.
An example would be the smoke from a nuclear bomb. It goes straight up and then makes a puff up here that makes it look like a mushroom.
Because what did it do to the atmosphere around it? It moved it out so that it went up. What happened after it had gone up? Air returned to fill in that space. That's the nuclear mushroom that you're talking about. So you create a vacuum, and in that vacuum is the smoke. Well, there was a substance that was made. My mind is going too fast. I can't keep up with myself. Ma'ala Ashan. Ma'ala Ashan is created by the family called Avtinus. The Avtinus family had the secret for the smoke going up. They had an ingredient that they would add to the mix of 11 chemicals, the 11 spices that were used, and it would cause it to go up. In fact, they were the only ones who had it. In fact, the Sanhedrin and the rabbis, they all got mad. And they said, you need to tell us what that recipe is. And they says, no, we won't. Okay, then you're no longer in charge of the smoke. We'll get somebody else. And so they went to Egypt, down to the school in Alexandria, where there are great Hebrew sages down there. And so they said, would you make it? Sure, I'll try. And so they began to work on it, but they could never get the smoke to go straight up. They could get it to go out, but they couldn't get it to go up. Finally, the rabbi said, look, this isn't working. You can do it, but why won't you let us know what the recipe is? Why won't you tell us? And he says, our greatest fear is someday somebody else is going to have an offering just like ours. And somebody else may now begin to make what we're doing. And it is special only to God. Because you see, God was the one who gave us the recipe, nobody else. And so they refused to give it to anybody. In fact, the recipe is being handed down within the family. Now, the question is, do you know any of the Avtinuses? I don't either, but they still exist. The family still has the recipe for the incense, that they can cause the smoke to go straight up. When will they use it? When we build a temple again, or when they find the tabernacle. Because you see, Larry just was over in Israel just last week. I wrote him and asked him, I says, Larry, can you give me some help reminding me of some of the things that we talked about? And he said, I just got back, and what I want you to remember is just below the incense is the para aduma, the holy cow. No, that was Harry Carey that had the holy cow. The red heifer. The red heifer. Just beneath it. When we were there, there's the side of the cave. You can see the two columns. They're still there. But off to the side, there are a bunch of boulders. Like the red dust of the incense, they don't belong there. They're not made of the same material that the rest of the mountain is made of. Somebody brought in these boulders. According to the stories, when they got past the incense, they were to continue down, and you will see a blue light inside a dark cave. When you see the blue light, know that you are there. Where is there? Where the para aduma is, and where they expect to find the tabernacle standing. Completely standing. Built by Jeremiah, left erect, with all of the furnishings, except one. What furnishing is it missing?
The Ark.
The Ark of the Covenant. That's the only ingredient that's not in the tabernacle. Now, why will that not be there? Because God's presence isn't here. Remember what happened in the second temple? There was no Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant was not there. God's presence, the Shekinah, was not there. But it will be there when the Mashiach comes. So the question is, do the rabbis know where it is? And the answer is yes. They know where it is. Heard it from several reliable sources. Rabbi Sutton can tell you where it's at. Rabbi Greenbaum can tell you where it's at. Several of them can tell you where it's at. But you see, they're all over there in Israel. They already know where it's at. It was found about 30 years ago in a special place, known to them, to which they go to in the evenings nearby and pray at that site. Again, things that are going on. The incense, if we understand that God's presence is there and that God wants to be with us, the incensers who remind us. Remember, there were 5 senses that we had when we were back in the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve, Hava. And one of the problems was that 4 of those senses were destroyed because they were involved in the sin with the evil snake. What ingredient, what sense in our body was not there, was not needed to sin? Our incense, our nose, sense of smell was not involved in the apple, the prune, the fig, whatever it was that they ate. That was the only sense that was not involved. Touch, taste, all of those were involved. Hearing, sense of smell. The sense of smell is to bring us to God. The closer we become to God, the closer that fragrance is to our nostrils, the closer we get to the end. To Rabbi Shimon, it was important to put yourself there. How would you do that? You would pray. Morning and evening. For that sense of smell. The sense of the garden. The sense of that. It's 8 o'clock. You guys have been here for 50-some minutes listening to me ramble. Does anybody have any questions? I hope not. But if you do, I can answer a couple more. Easy ones.
I thought it was very interesting hearing you talk about the smoke. I didn't hear anything reference the
Nuclear?
Yeah. Because wasn't Albert Einstein Jewish?
Certainly was. Non-practicing. That's the amazing thing. Do you realize the percentage of Jews who actually have created something worthwhile in this world? By far, they have outdone anything any other national group, ethnic group could ever say they've done. They're just amazing people.
More Nobel Prizes.
More Nobel Prizes, absolutely. And in all fields. But again, why is that? If you're a rabbi studying to be a rabbi, truly in Israel, you are not just a rabbi, you also have a occupation, a field of study that you are good at. One of the men I love to listen to, even though I have a hard time listening to and understanding, is Rabbi Ginsburg. Rabbi Ginsburg has 2 doctorates besides his rabbinical papers. One in physics and the other in math. They're kind of similar, tied together. But the concept is that they could support themselves. That was something that was necessary as they were going through life. Eventually, it came to the point where the students would help pay for their way. But that, at the beginning, you must have some sort of an occupation. That's why it was so amazing what these people have been able to accomplish and how brilliant many of them are. So anyway. Yeah, go ahead.
A couple of comments on the
Sure.
sense of smell and the spices. My understanding, and I think you've hit on it very well, is that we don't have the incense, but we have our prayers, and they're to go up like the incense. They go straight up, and then they spread out, and they permeate, the atmosphere. And that in the Havdalah ceremony that we do, one of the things that we do is smell the spices, because mystically we receive a double portion, an extra soul or whatever. And so, and smell too is supposed to be the strongest sense, because sometimes, you may smell something and instantly that maybe you haven't smelled that for years, but you identify it just perfectly. So.
Touches our memory cord.
Right.
If you get into the brain studies, smell is one of the ways that they have of trying to trigger amnesiacs. If they can figure out where they came from in the first place, they use the sense of smell. Again, God has done lots of things that we are just now beginning to even think about understanding or begin to apply. All of those things are just in his head, which is so amazing.
I've read something, and I know that I can't explain it or even articulate it, but something about that Hashem will search us out by our smell, that we all have a smell. I don't know where I read that.
But there's, again, yeah.
And with the spices, there was one, I think it's the one that starts with a C, that I've read that was very unpleasant. But it's mixed with all the others, and so that's kind of to show us that,
You triggered another thought in me. We call it an altar, mezbach, the same as the outer altar is a mezbach. The outer altar has animals that are being offered up. So in other words, it has a function that we can recognize. What's the function of burning incense that you and I can't see, but spiritually is happening all the time? One of the things that it was in Man Leos, which is whoever smelled the fragrances of the incense and when it was being burned, thought of repentance at all the time, and his heart would be purified of all the evil thoughts by the defilement of the evil urge. The word for mizbach is the word for slaughter. So the question then came to the rabbis, what is being slaughtered then on an altar where there's nothing being offered other than the incense itself? Our evil urges. That is what we're offering up. When you and I pray, we're offering up those urges to try to cleanse ourselves, whether we recognize it or not. It's a spiritual act. The same thing was going on here. And again, how far away was God from the altar of incense? It was the closest thing to him. Is that not what we try to do? To get as close to him as we possibly can. That was what it was there for. If you come with the wrong intention, it's not a good thing, because you're close to judgment. But if you came sincere, seeking God, seeking to offer, seeking to draw close, does God turn you away? No, he knows your heart. He knows your heart. Therefore, those urges that you had, that you're wanting to get rid of, you leave them there. When they came up to the Temple Mount and they offered their offerings, did they take the dead leftovers with them? No, they left them there. They walked away from their sin. That is what we are to do. Go away knowing that God has taken them. Now, it's much easier to see it in a physical sense, but it's also more painful. I am one person who I have trouble killing a bug, let alone a cow or a sheep or a bird or anything else. The fact that I would give that up, that animal part of me, because that's what you were doing. You were giving up part of you. You were giving up your animal personality. That's what that offering was about. I could see myself giving away corn because I really don't like corn that well. So that meal offering wouldn't bother me very much. But some of that other stuff would bother me greatly. But you understand what I'm saying. Now, my wife couldn't deal with the wine oblation because of the fact that she likes wine too much, so that she, never mind. Back to the story. The concept is that you're offering up something, you're giving away, attempting to draw close. That's what this chapter is about. God wanted them to be as close as possible. He wanted to take them back to Sinai because, you see, if they would have been able to wait for him, as we talked about last Thursday, if they could have waited for him, we would have been back to the Garden of Eden. Everything would have been worked out.
Because when they first gathered at Sinai, it says they camped as one, and that singular camped is singular. It's not plural. So they were echad then.
And that's what he wanted here. Vayakel. He wanted them as one. He gathered the crowd. But you see, the crowd at the story of the golden calf, they gathered around Aaron, but not as one. Each one had his own purpose in having them there. And that's another story. I like this story. How many of you know, well, a couple of you know, how many of you know what it was that Aaron was forming? Because Aaron formed something that turned into the golden calf.
A bag of some sort?
Well, he's forming in the bag all their jewelry, but what was he forming it into? Tell him.
Somebody else, maybe, because I've talked.
Tell him. You know.
Was it like the horns?
It wasn't a horn, it was the cherubim, the cherubim. You see, that's the only idol that God accepted, was the cherubim that would sit on the top of the ark. Aaron knew that. That's why he could form that. But what came out was a calf. Why did it come out? Simple story. When Moses wanted to bring Joseph's body back to the land, they found the body buried in water in a lead coffin. Moses couldn't have picked up the lead coffin. So Moses took a plate, and on the plate, he wrote, Ale Shor, rise ox, because you see, Joseph was the ox. And so that little plate, threw it into the water. The coffin came up. They took the coffin away. And a little man named Micah came up and grabbed it. And Micah, after he grabbed it, according to the Midrashic stories, put it in his pocket. And when he was there and they were forming the cherubim, he threw it into the pot. So what came out was not a cherubim, not an ox, or it was an ox, a calf, a baby ox that was starting to grow and live. Had Moses allowed it to continue, they would have had a living dead thing, a golem. Go ahead.
Is that why Moses had them eat the dust?
And what did it do to them?
I believe that.
They died of their sins. Those that weren't there, what did they do? He sent the Levites out to get them. And they went through the village. And I guess the book would have been called Helter Skelter. Because anybody who was left, the Levites knew who it was, they took them out. That would have been the name. And then they sent Aaron back out because what else was going on in the village at the same time? A plague. And so he went out with some incense that he just so happened to bring down with him. And that incense that he just so happened to bring down with him, put it into a fire pan and ran through the village. Doing what? Brought healing and death, depending on whom you were. The plague ended that day. That's another midrashic story. I like midrashic stories because they help me to understand how things ended up the way they were. But that's all a part of the oral, and that's all a part of what Ezra and all of the 120 assemblies put together for us to know. The only thing is it took us a long time for the Jews to let us know what it was that we should have known. But again, it wasn't for us, as Rabbi Gettinger up where I'm from told me. Because you see, I want to be a Gentile. I don't want to be a Jew. And I said, I just want to be a B'nai Noach and the best I could possibly be. So could you help me out? So, go ahead.
The instance that you talked about earlier, was it witnessed by people, or was it just with the high priest?
What do you mean?
Like the incense that rose up, like into a pillar, and you were talking about
It was used every day. One day it was inside, and the only one who would have seen it would have been the high priest. When it was in the holy place, the other 364 days, it would have been taken care of again by Cohen, but it would have gone straight through the roof of whatever building they were in. Literally, if it was in the temple, it went through the temple wall roof all the way up and then permeated out.
So the people who lives in the area
Would have seen it.
Would have seen it, so it has been witnessed.
Yeah.
And smelled it.
And smelled
I
it.
read that women didn't wear perfumes.
They didn't need to.
They didn't need to.
Nope. Nor were there any flies to bother them or anything else.
What?
No flies.
I thought you said lice.
No. There probably weren't any lice either, but there weren't any flies. Are we done? Are you thoroughly satisfied, Michael? Did you get my good side? All right.